Oh boy, it's my favorite time of the year. Or, I thought it was. This year beat me into submission. I hate everything. I hate video games. Alright, let's get it started. So before we get into the list, I gotta mention that top 5 is about, games that start disappointing-ish, kinda bad, mediocre, and then we move down to the shit, to the garbage. So, we're going to be starting off with games that are not necessarily horrendous, but games that are still kind of disappointing, kind of bad. With that being said, we're going to start it off with Stronghold Warlords. I liked the original Stronghold. I don't hold nostalgia for the series either. I got into the series when a friend gave me the HD collection on Steam. I liked that it was similar to Dungeon Keeper in the way it mixed RTS elements and economy management. The pacing and design of the campaign was perfect. New buildings and units were drip-fed to you as you played throughout its lengthy campaign. As your toolset of buildings and units got bigger, so did the pool of maps and enemy types. Despite the campaign being a glorified tutorial, it was still really fun as you would deal with waves and waves of enemies and defend your stronghold. The game had a lot of charm with its Monty Python-esque style of humor, with tons of overdone European accents and mannerisms. Stronghold Warlords is unfortunately another disappointing entry in this once legendary series. It's not a bad game, but it's only a step back from the original despite releasing 20 years later. It just feels like the same game, but with an Asian theme over it. The mannerisms and accents are there, I guess, but it's not nearly as good as the original. And the whole game just screams cheap. Not economic cheap, not budget cheap, but cheap. Graphics just look muddy and terrible, and the pacing just feels off. Stronghold was always engaging and fun, but I feel like half the time I'm just waiting around in this one or throwing blobs of units at enemy positions with no strategy. The launch of this game was also pretty bad too, as tons of bugs and glitches were present, including performance issues. Yeah, a game that looks like this had performance issues. They couldn't even add a borderless windowed mode in a game where you'll be just sitting around waiting for resources to come in. So have fun alt-tabbing and having the screen flip out on you when you tab back in whenever you get bored, which is going to be quite often. Stronghold 1's campaign had a much slower start, and yet this game feels 1,000 times worse despite giving you more units to play with. I honest to God did not want to play anymore after like an hour or two, so I pretty much dropped the game, and I really tried to play this. I tried to return to it months later after a bunch of patching was put in, and all credit to Firefly, the developer, they are supporting their games. But I just wasn't feeling this one at all. It was so boring. What a disappointment, especially after they had said they'd learned their mistakes from previous titles and were trying to hype this one up. Ultimately, I feel it deserves number 5 for those reasons. Once again, more of a disappointment, not necessarily a bad game. It might be worth a shot on a deep discount, but honestly, you'd be better off looking into other sim strategy franchises like Settlers, Anno, or War for the Overworld. Or just go play Crusader HD or Stronghold 1 HD on Steam. Hell, I even heard Stronghold 2's Steam edition is actually a better game than this. Number 4, MechWarrior 5, Mercenaries. I juggled where I would put Warlords and Mercenaries on the list as they both are interchangeable in a way. They both have better predecessors, both have repetitive or mediocre gameplay, but I think MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries manages to be just a bit worse. At least Stronghold Warlords was somewhat endearing for its campaign narrative. This game's campaign is just boring. Technically, this game came out on the Epic Game Store in 2020, but it had all these problems before hitting Steam, so I figured with this new Steam launch and all the new updates we'd be getting, maybe it would be somehow worth the wait. Well, it wasn't. Mercenaries' story feels like an afterthought with mixed voice acting and voice direction, hideous character models, and incredibly subpar dialogue. The gameplay is just so repetitive and simplistic at the end of the day, though. This is a game about controlling a giant, slow-moving mech robot, and that's fun. I like the idea of blasting through enemies with methodical robotic movement and careful consideration and calculation. But honestly, the sound design and shooting mechanics are just missing the mark totally. I played slow-moving mech segments in other games that were just better than this entire game. If you're a fan of playing as a big, stompy, lumbering mech and you're just dying for something new, this is unfortunately your only option right now, but I'd probably just look into getting MechWarrior 4 working. Somehow that game actually looks better in some regards than this one, and that game came out 22 years ago. I think your mech game fanatic is going to find some fun through the apparently healthy modding community and pretty good baseline movement control system. Dull feeling combat aside, it does feel like you're in a big stompy mech, which is unfortunately a rarity. Even then, the limited customization and HOTAS support out of the box is going to do no favors for these die-hard fans. I think there is a somewhat fun game underneath all these problems, but the subpar story experience in the single player does absolutely nothing to attract new players like myself into this world, and the steep learning curve for non-hardcore players who would otherwise enjoy playing online only are going to be disappointed, especially with the pretty subpar performance, visuals, and extremely restricting co-op mode. Maybe with more post-launch support, mods, and various improvements to the co-op aspect, we might see some kind of good, Frankenstein, modern mech game, but for now, MechWarrior 5 gets the number 4 spot on my list. Not necessarily beyond redemption, not horrible, but extremely disappointing, and ultimately boring. Number 3, Subverse. When it comes to the adult game industry, I feel that we have a lot of opportunities to make something kind of unique, something a little different. I'm not talking about just, jacketed to porn. I'm talking about, like, actual dark subject matter that you can't put in a, retail store with, an M rating on it. No, it's got to be specially sold in, like, these niche areas that are not controlled by people who get offended so easily, to say the least. And I feel that this is a area to push the medium and also look at some titties too. And sometimes, both work out really well. Unfortunately, Subverse doesn't do any of that, really. I mean, it has the titties and they're okay, but the game is kind of shit, honestly. This is a game that was kickstarted for $2 million, took a very long time to come out, comes out in early access, okay? Comes out in early access, and the content that comes out is very limited. The gameplay sucks. It's terrible. And you might think, like, oh, it's playing it for the gameplay? That's like playing it for the story. Well, no, because you can do cool things with an adult medium over a gameplay mechanic. You can make cool stuff. And if you don't do that, that's fine. But you have to have your gameplay be pretty good. You gotta be like Sengoku Rants, right? You gotta make an amazing turn-based SRPG that also happens to have a bunch of nudie bits. A lot of people actually play that game just for the gameplay. It's crazy. Imagine if a pornographic story had a writing similar to Citizen Kane. That's kind of the idea here. And Subverse doesn't do either. It's a crappy video game. It's a subpar porn game. It's just bad. It's just not very good. Like, it just sucks.
My work continues.
Number 2, Dungeons & Dragons Dark Alliance. This game launched in a piss-poor state. Week 1 of launch, I was finding difficulty getting players of equal standing in my group, dealing with disconnects, lackluster netcode, and overall just a one-sided balancing system, where in the first online game I played, I was paired with someone many levels higher than me, causing me to contribute almost nothing. I would die so easily. This was my first attempt just getting into an online game. Needless to say, myself and many other players had a terrible first impressions of this title. So in response, the developers started patching the game and added new content over the course of several months, and honestly, you know what? After returning to it with the lowest expectations for the sole purpose of just getting footage for this list and hating it, I started to kind of enjoy it. While the actual combat system is a bit repetitive, the animations are flashy and there are some fun abilities. Co-op does leave room for more than just fun with friends, adding a few extra mechanics beyond just a reviving system. The hectic battles of enemies throwing attacks at you everywhere and constantly dealing with explosions and area of effect attacks makes for an involved and engaging combat system. There's also a bit of incentive to run around and explore to find treasure and complete side objectives, making the maps feel a little bit less linear. So with all that said, why is it number 2? Because no one is playing this shit anymore! A month after launch, this game almost lost its entire player base, and peak counts on a good day are under 30. Not 30,000 players, 30 players. A multiplayer-focused co-op game at $40 with no one playing it is the kiss of death, and the lack of players is entirely on the developer for releasing this game in such a piss-poor state, and still not totally fixing or balancing the game or adhering to their promises even months and months later is just insulting. Even with all these patches, the game is still so ridiculously underdeveloped. The combat system is still clunky and missing critical mechanics that would make it way better, such as dodging out of combos. The game also features a horrendous lock-on system. The camera just was not designed for this thing. I often just turned it off because it's just so bad. And it's just play any character action game and go play this and realize, wow, this is just so slow and unresponsive. Even if you could enjoy the combat system, which I almost kind of did, you'll find that there's no one to enjoy it with. The problem is that this game is very much a loot-based RPG, and this game is designed around playing the same levels over and over again, meaning there's going to be a ton of repetitive grinding with little to no variation in how you approach levels, especially if you play solo, which you're going to have to do. The loot system is honestly not worth it either. It's just your generic passive stats. +5 to critical hit chance, +10 to frost resistance, the same uninspired loot you've seen in the most uninspired of titles. The problem is that this game's progression is directly tied around the loot system. While there is a bit of attention to detail regarding the game's setting and the voice acting is quite good, they've essentially designed the game in favor of this loot treadmill that's just endlessly disappointing. A mediocre skill tree isn't going to keep your attention. Its flashy but ultimately shallow combat system will not hold your attention longer than a single level without bringing along some extra players or characters. And you can't even do that. The online player base is dead. The local co-op that the developers promised would be in the first DLC update has not been implemented, and there are no bots to supplement playing harder difficulties to avoid tedious amounts of solo play grinding. The balance is also completely out of whack. Sometimes you get to bosses and they go down by just sitting there and you just wailing on them, and at other times you can have enemies up to that point almost like one-shot you, doing tons of damage, or hazards that do tons of damage and almost knock you out, even though up until that point nothing would indicate that these things would be even that strong. The balancing in this game is just a total mess. This game exists in 2 instances, the one at launch and the one now. At launch, it was a buggy, overpriced pile of crap with a limited amount of content. Now it's a kind of enjoyable co-op game, but with no one to play with you in co-op. Either way, both versions of the game exist with bugs, false promises, and a terrible progression system, and a player base that was ultimately killed by the developer decision-making. Had this game launched like it is now at maybe $15 with a local and online co-op component, things would have probably been very different, and perhaps they might be if the developers continue updating the game. But given the poor reception of this title, that's wishful thinking. As the game stands in 2021, this is the second worst game. At least the other games tried to carve out some kind of niche, and they failed, okay? But they tried to carve out a niche. This game is as generic and formulaic as they come, and it was still a fucking mess. But despite its problems, it was at least a bunch of developers creating and supporting something from scratch. You can admire they actually cared and wanted to fix their mistakes, and maybe they were under a bunch of tight deadlines because, you know, it is a licensed game. They did want to improve their product, they did add post-launch support. Lord knows the next game didn't even try. Hey, sorry once again to do another rug pull on you guys like I did last year. The last game on this list, the worst game of 2021, just like the worst game of 2020, will be a separate video because I just started recording and it's looking to be like 20 minutes long of unedited audio. So I gotta crunch that down, and even then, it's still gonna be longer than all 4 of these games combined. So it might as well be its own separate video. It'll be fine. I'll have more time to work on it, and you'll like it a little bit more. Anyway, if you guys like good games, good video games, well, you should check out my top 5 best games of 2021. There's some real bangers in there. Some really fun games, fun times, but not like this one. This sucked. This year was kind of mixed. I feel like it was a great year for indies and double A's and maybe like one AAA game, but everything else was just kind of shit. It was shit. All right. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. Once again, I'm sorry about not completing the list. I'll have it done, I swear. I'm out.